you're welcome to the Swords of 2017 and our up-to-date version of the history of it. And this is to replace a video Swords Historical Society made in 30 years ago in 1986. And we're comparing the swords of then to the swords now, and it's interspersed with bits of the history of the area that you mightn't know about. Now this year I haven't done it on my own. I have roped in Dr. James Bennett, whom a lot of you may know. He was the schoolmaster in the Old Borough School for over 45 years. So between the two of us, we've done our best to bring you up to date and bring you back to the past.
Yeah, no, I'm just, I suppose, delighted to have this opportunity as the Mayor of Fingal and living in Swords. I think it's 10 years. I think Michael Kennedy was a previous person from based in Swords who was Lord Mayor. I think before that you had Tom Kelleher and Cyril Gallagher, so there hasn't been too many of us. So no, I'm just delighted to have this opportunity as part of the video, just to to thank Bernadette and the Swords Historical Society. This work they do is absolutely fantastic, that you all do, that you're all involved in today. It really is fantastic that it's, we're leaving something to be passed on to the next generation, and I'm chuffed, to be honest with you, really proud to be part of it.
Right, we're starting today at what we used to call the top of the town, and people have taken to calling that particular part Main Street, but it was always known as Dublin Street, which ran down into Main Street. And the first house there that we want to talk about is now the Lord Mayor's Pub, a striking thatched building at the top of the town. It was originally O'Toole's Pub, and there are lots of stories about O'Toole's. There was a place called O'Toole's Gardens up there as well, where I think they used to have circuses and swinging boats. The pub was sold in 1980 and bought by the Savage family, who are well known in the business life of the town. And at the same time, Joe Savage happened to be the Lord Mayor of Swords. Now, the pub was, when it was O'Toole's too, at the back, it was quite extensive. There was a ball alley. You could go down steps at the side into this ball alley, and the fellas used to play handball.
Now, looking across the road here, we have a house called Turnpike House. And what's the significance of Turnpike House? A turnpike was a pole on the road which was across to stop carriages going down the town. To get through the town, you had to pay a fee, and this money was to go towards the maintenance of the roads. Now, because the carriages had steel rims on them, they were very, very hard on the roads. There wasn't tarmac at them, so the roads were being destroyed with these heavy. So if a person wanted to go down the town, they had to pay at the toll. Now, across the road from me there were a number of cottages. Well, one of the cottages was the band room, but I want to talk about the band room, not when it played, but on an occasion when it didn't play. The famous strike in 1913 of the farm labourers. September 1913, the farm labourers were looking for money. Now, the difficulty was the farmers of Swords and Fingal in general couldn't really have collective bargaining because all of their situations were different. So the farm labourers strike. They were going to march up to one of the houses in late September 1913, where some of the farmers had come together to work the land, and they wanted a loan of the instruments. The RIC surrounded the building because they were afraid of riots. The farm labourers ended up inside in the building with the police outside, and what they did for the day was they didn't play the instruments, they just spent their time banging the bass drum. And that was a prelude to much, much more serious riots, which happened in October of that year, when there was an attempt to drive sheep and cattle through the town.
We come to what was Super Quinn, and that was originally Swords Cinema. Now, Swords Cinema was a great boon when I was a child. I remember nagging at my mother to give me fourpence to go to see Hopalong Cassidy every Sunday. And because before that, we used to actually walk to Malahide to go to the pictures, and we'd all walk out in the middle of the road and say, keep in, here's a car. So you can guess that I'm quite ancient. But the cinema was built by a man called, what we used to call Mr. Bray. Tom Bray was his name. And last year, with all the 1916 stuff, I discovered that Mr. Bray had been involved in the 1916 Rising. He was a Limerick man, but we always knew him as this old fella that ran the cinema, and we went to it every Sunday afternoon. And then sometimes there would be travelling shows would come along, and there'd be pantomimes and different things like that. But it was a great place for when there was nothing else going on. You're talking about pre-television times, and many a person kind of met their husband or their wife in Sword Cinema, and there's lots of stories to be told about it. But eventually, Mr. Bray gave it up, and then the front of it was used. I think there was a scout shop in it and a few different things until Super Quinn bought it. It was sold again, and it's now Penny's, and it's a huge big complex, and you can go right through and right out through into the Pavilion Shopping Centre. An interesting building at the corner of the Malahide Road even today is the local Garda station, which is much more busy than it was years ago when I was growing up. The original Garda station was a farmer's house on the corner there, which belonged to people called Maguire. And it was taken over in 1922 by the Gardaí, and it was the first Garda station in the new state. So that's a bit of history for Swords. So down along then further, there's still some of the houses along there that were always there. And then you came to what was Donnelly's Forge, and it's now Galvin's Hardware, which is there still. And the story about the Donnelly brothers was that somewhere along the line, two of them, they fell out with each other. And one of them, there was Matt and Mick, as far as I remember. I remember going in there when I was very small and seeing a big fire, and it was very dark. And we actually have the Velos and the anvil from Donnelly's Forge here in our museum. But Matt and Mick fell out anyway, and I don't know which is which, but one worked out the back and he had his own customers, and the other fellow worked out, and they never spoke to each other. So that's how it worked. But eventually they were elderly, they died, and Peter Galvin took it over and converted it. And at one stage, Galvins lived in the house. It was like a two-storey house, and then eventually they moved out. Now, beside that then is which was the Borough School, and the old Borough School, and it's now a pub, and it has a very turbulent history.
We're outside the old Borough pub, where we're going to talk about the history of the school that was here prior to it becoming a public house. Prior to 1800, the Borough of Swords returned 2 members of Parliament to the old Irish Parliament, which was at College Green near the Trinity College. When this Parliament was done away with in 1800 as a result of the Act of Union, £15,000 was granted to the people of Swords as compensation for the loss of voting rights and the loss of jobs. Lots of people applied for a compensation. None of them qualified because Swords was deemed to be a rotten borough. Instead, it was decided to provide a school or schools for the benefit of the people of the town. In 1804, the famous architect Francis Johnson was asked to design a school, and this school was ready in 1809, the Borough School. The school did very, very well initially, and from 1809 onwards into the 1830s, it was actually doing so well. A second school was opened, an infant school, which is now the old schoolhouse restaurant. So we have 2 schools. We have the Borough School and we have the infant school. Now we'll say just a very, very brief bit about the school. In addition to all the benefits which I mentioned, there was also a scholarship scheme which became known as the Fee. There were prizes for regular attendance and there were prizes for the best students. I'm not going to develop that in any kind of detail. If you want to read more, Sewn by Candlelight by Bernadette Marks and Greatly Benefited by Andrew Whiteside cover this in much, much more detail. You'd wonder at all of this imaginative, ambitious stuff that there would be problems. But onwards from the 1830s, there were problems. And I have to go back a tiny, tiny bit. Catholic emancipation in 1829, when the Catholics got some rights, and in 1831, the Irish national school system was set up. There wasn't universal primary education anywhere in the world. I'm be careful about saying that, but it definitely wasn't anywhere under the British rule. And it was called the Irish Education Experiment because they wanted to see how it would get on in Ireland before they tried it in England. The Catholic Church welcomed it, particularly James Doyle, the Bishop of Kildare in Loughlin, who thought there was no better way to unite people than to have children educated together. 1853, all of the Catholics were withdrawn from the school because of an objection to a book based on the Gospels of St. Matthew and Mark. Cardinal Cullen gave £800 to build a new school, and the school that was built on Seatown Road. And things continued and continued right up until the late 1870s, when there was a second commission, and the main man on this commission, or one of the main people, was Randolph Churchill, who was Winston Churchill's father. The debate continued without any sign of any satisfactory outcome until the 1880s, mid-1880s, when it was decided, look, mixed education is not working. We have to separate Catholics and Protestants. So what was done was the Catholics were given 11/13 of the original money and going to be allowed to build a new school. The Church of Ireland people were given 2/13 and they were going to close the infant school because they no longer had the numbers, and that's how the borough school became known as the Old Borough School, and the school in Seatown Road was the New Borough School. That was going to be just now for boys, and there was a new girls' school built down the road on North Street, and that opened in 1890.
The other side, there was a thatched house which belonged to people called Walshes, and they were called Walshes the pump borers, and probably would have been responsible for putting an early form of central heating into a lot of the great houses around. And then you see some of the old pumps that were around have their name on it, and the first pumps were square. The other thing about the Walshes, the Gordon Bennett race, which was early when motor cars were becoming popular, there was this race, and it came through Swords one time, and in 1904, and the car broke down on one of the guys, and he didn't know what to do because they didn't have garages around with petrol pumps like we know them now. So somebody suggested that Mr. Walsh might be able to mend it. So he did. Whenever he went out and whatever he did, he was able to get this car going again. So that was his claim to fame. Now, the dispensary was elsewhere at one time, but we have the minutes of the old dispensary, and you could just imagine them meeting every Saturday in some old cobwebby place, and there was great discussions going on about building the new dispensary, and which was opened in 1898 about. In the meantime, across the other side of the road, there lived a man called Paddy Cleary, who was a relation of mine. He was the first cousin of my granny's, and he worked as a ploughman up in Early's farm in Mountgorry. And when he was coming home one day, he was bitten by a mad dog, which had rabies, which meant certain death in those days. So he had been treated by Dr. Davies at this stage, and there were 3 or 4 other people were bitten as well. And this Dr. O'Donnell then suggested that they should send them to Paris to the Pasteur Clinic to be cured. And it was going on, and they didn't know whether they should do it or not. Eventually he talked them into doing it. And these 5 people were sent off to Paris, and one of them was a child of 3, a man called George Proctor, who lived on the Malahide Road. And his mother went with them as a kind of a chaperone. And she was given £3, or no, £30, I think. Yeah, £30 she was given to take the 5 people off to Paris and stay in a guest house for 3 weeks and be treated in the Pasteur Clinic. So they came back, and I remember I was 10 when Paddy died. He lived to be 88 afterwards, and he was ploughing nearly up to the time he died. The dispensary was there, and we know it as children when we were going to the national school, we used to be sent up there to get our teeth out and all places like that. But it outgrew the town now. Like, it was a wonderful place, I'd say, when there were only about 2,000 people here, but now we've 50,000 people, and I think the health centre they built down on Bridge Street is probably even not big enough now. So that's the dispensary. We'll continue down now from the dispensary, and the next building of note was what we call the curate's house, which is a fine I call holy looking house set in off the road, like there's a bit of a driveway into it. And it was built about in the 1890s by a parish priest there at the time called Father Mulcahy. I was in it there last year, and they actually have the same hall in it and the black and white tiles. And I was telling one of the girls that she was a foreign girl that was working there. I said, this belonged to the priest. And she said, oh, I didn't know that. And she was fascinated to think that it belonged to the priest. But down after that, then you come down along, and there was a shop called Coleman's in the olden times. And this was where Richard Coleman was born, who was the one of the leaders here in the 1916 Rising. And you'll see the plaque up over the door, which was erected in some years ago by his nephew, who was also Richard O'Coleman. But the Colemans were an old Swords family. They originally came and they worked in Swords House for the tailors of Swords House. And the mother's maiden name was Murray, and she kept a shop there. And the father was a teacher in the school. He was he was one of these ones that got on through the system of education. So he mightn't have been very highly qualified, but he taught in the school anyway. But there were a lot of these Colemans, huge big family, and a lot of their ancestors are still alive. And as I said before, they were related to these Walshes that lived up further, but they were a family of note, and they were a very Republican family. When we came down along, then there was a pub called, in our time, the Central Bar, and before that, at one time, people called Daly's owned it, and it was called Daly's Hotel, or the Greyhound. And when these Daly's owned it, it was quite a feature of the lockout. Came into the hands of the Taylor family owned it, and it was the Central Bar for a long time. So down further then, we had, in olden times, a hotel called Early's Hotel. And Early's Hotel belonged to a family called Early, obviously, who farmed up in Mountgorry, where I was reared, on the Malahide Road. And somewhere along the line, they decided to get away from farming. Two of the sons were solicitors, and there was a daughter called Helena, so she decided she wanted to be a solicitor as well. And she was the first, they say it's on record, that she was the first lady solicitor in Ireland. And I remember her well, because our Paddy that I mentioned was their ploughman, and she used to come out to see him when he was elderly in bed. I remember her coming out. And a funny thing, I was only small, and this lady arrived, and she used to smoke with a cigarette holder, and her hair was dyed blue, and I thought she was very strange, and I was laughing, and my mother kept telling me, no, don't be doing that, but she was a very nice person, and she was the first lady solicitor in Ireland, it's on record anyway. But they were Early's Hotel. And then there was a saying years ago, Early's Hotel was where they used to stop the coaches and change their horses in the back. There was a lane at the back. And then they had a connection. One of them was married to one of the Kettles of Drynham, that were another well-known family here. In the 1950s and 60s, Taylor's had a grocery shop in it. And they had a warehouse down further, which was hardware and clothes. Then eventually they turned it into, they gave up grocery, and it was a very large drapery shop, which ran for a long time. And then they decided to give that up, and they moved the hardware up there, and it was that's the way a lot of people now would remember it. It was a huge big hardware business up to, say, maybe 10 years ago.
After that, we come to Swords Castle, the main building in the town. At the time of the Norman invasion, the Archbishop of Dublin was St. Lawrence O'Toole. Lawrence O'Toole died in 1180 and was succeeded in 1181 by an Englishman, John Comyn, who was a great favourite of Henry II. So in addition to being a churchman, he also was the owner of a large amount of land. Now, because of the level of grievance from the Irish with regard to the Normans taking over from them, he needed to be protected. So he built Swords Castle, or had it built, somewhere around 1200. Now, it was hoped that the castle would serve as an example of English civility and keep the Irish in check. Comyn died in 1212 and was succeeded by Henry de Laundre. Now, that name became Lowndes. And he was even better got, so he was given more land on the condition that he would build a castle on the other side at Glendalough, so that both sides, north and south of Dublin, were being protected from the marauding Irish. We move our story on very, very quickly to 1316, when Edward Bruce, who was invited over by the Irish because they wanted to get rid of the Normans, destroyed the castle. He left it in a state of ruin. And moving slightly on there, Alexander de Bicknor, who succeeded Comyn in Lawrence, he managed to annoy the king so much that he was called to an inquisition. He was asked to account for his stewardship, and particularly with regard to the monies and so on, because there wasn't enough coming to the crown. At the audit, it was said that the castle was in need of thorough repair, but de Bicknor had already vacated it and had moved the Archbishop's Palace across to Tallaght, and they stayed in Tallaght from 1324 to the 1820s. There was no great amount of renovation done in the castle from the 1300s onwards, but in 1583, the Viceroy, Sir Henry Sidney, brought into Swords Castle a colony of Dutch weavers, who he hoped might show some example of industry to the lazy natives. He had a letter written up in 1583. I caused to plant and inhabit there about 40 families of the Reformed churches of the Low Countries, flying there for religion's sake in one ruinous town called Swords. And truly, sir, it would have done any man good to have seen how diligently they wrought, how they re-edified the quite spoiled old castle of the same town and repaired almost all of the same. This was in the late 1580s. Swords Castle came to prominence again during the wars of the Catholic Confederation in 1641. On the 5th of December 1641, Luke Netterville of Corblis near Donabate issued a proclamation that the gentlemen of the county of Dublin should assemble at Swords upon pain of death. On the 8th of December 1641, he raised an army of about 1,200 men who were going to fight for religious liberty. And among the local gentry who attended, and we've already talked about some of these, George Blackney, which name we know as Blakeney of Rathbeal Hall, Russell of Drynham, Russell of Seatown, Beeling of Beelinstown, Barnwall and John Taylor. The following day, the Lords Justice issued a warrant commanding all of these people to appear in Dublin. The 9 principal persons didn't attend, and a reward of £400 was put on the head of Netterville. Sir Charles Coote was sent to sort them out, and he was being described as the most ferocious and bloodthirsty soldier of his time. He beat the men of Fingal out of their fortifications, killed about 200 of them, and as a reward he was granted a large portion of the estates forfeited by the Fingalian gentry. Among the people who lost their estates were Blakeney, Mansion House, Watermill and 200 acres, Russell, 335 acres down around Seatown Castle, Beeling, 300 acres out around Beelinstown, and John Taylor, the Manor House, which is where it is now the County Council offices. Church of Ireland was disestablished in 1869, and the castle was sold to the Cobb family of Newbridge House. They leased it to Robert Savage, who turned the grounds into an orchard and sold the produce in his shop. In 1985, the County Council purchased Swords Castle, and in subsequent years it commissioned a number of historical studies of the castle and its environs. In 1995, a plan for the phased restoration of the castle was approved by the County Council, by Fingal County Council that is. In 1996, work commenced on the restoration of the Constable's Tower. This was completed in 1998. And the restoration work on the castle has also been completed, and it was reopened in 2009. As we're speaking here today in 2017, the castle has now been opened to the public and the renovation work is continuing.
Right, well, we've come over the other side of the street now to what most of you will know as the Fingal County Council Civic Building, which some people didn't approve of, but I think it's all right there. We've got used to it. And but before that, it was Swords House, which was the home for generations of the Tailors of Swords. Now, the Tailors of Swords came here in something like 1225. They were an Anglo-Norman family who settled here. And of course, the castle was Anglo-Norman, which I think is probably how they came to be there. But they were there through history, and like their family tree shows that they married into all the big families down through the years. They were married to Barnwells and Fagans of Feltram and all these. They all sort of married into each other. But the way old people that I knew remembered it as Colonel Foster. Colonel Foster's, because Colonel Foster was the last member of the Taylor family to live there, and he died in 1915. He's buried up in Cullenkills graveyard. But he inherited the house through the female line. His mother was an Elizabeth Ann Taylor, who married a man called Josiah Foster, who was from the West Indies, and they came to Swords because the heir was a James Taylor, who I think he was a bit eccentric or something, which is why this Anne Taylor inherited it. But they donated. They were very good. They were one of these families who always remain Catholic, of course, and they donated the site for the St. Columkille's Church, which is up the lane, when they replaced it with an old one, which is further down where the Star Pub, at the back of where the Star Pub was. Now, when I was a child, I used to hear people calling it the billet, which when Colonel Foster died, it was during World War One, and there was a battalion of soldiers in it for some time. And when Colonel Foster died, it was sold to Nicholas Long, who owned Milton House, which is now where the Pavilion Shopping Centre is. And Milton, there was another house called Milton beside it. There were two Miltons, but when Nicholas Long died, it was inherited by his son Tom. And I used to hear my mother talking about how he tried to make it smaller, and maybe the way she described it, made bags of it. But it was there for a long time, beautiful house in the middle of the town, and big trees all around it, and a big gate, and you couldn't see into it. And like the domain went right up along the Chapel Lane where we used to go home from school. There was nothing there, only woods and fields. They're all houses now, that you would know, all these housing estates. But it was all part of Colonel Foster's back garden. So as time went by, then the county council took it over, and they first turned it into a park, which was people liked in the centre of the town. But there again, it was lovely in the beginning, but there was a lot of kind of vandalism went on. So eventually they decided, when the council split up, they decided to build the county hall there after a lot of toing and froing and people disagreeing. But we've got used to it being there now, and the same trees are all in front of it. The next, on the other side, walking up the town from the county hall, is the Star Pub, which recently has gone out of the hands of the Taylor family. They owned it for years. Originally there was another little building at the side too, which I say very few people alive now who remember it, but we had photographs of it. It was Fagan's, the harness makers, and that was knocked down in the 1930s to make the Chapel Lane wider. And when I was a child, there used to be public toilets at the back of the Star, and they were very popular because a lot of people hadn't got any toilets in their house at the time, and we all thought these flush toilets down the lane were wonderful. That's a long time ago, but when Taylors refurbished the Star, it was discovered that the place where the toilets were actually still belonged to Taylors, and they incorporated in the pub, so there's no public toilets in Swords now. But that was the Star, and it originally belonged to, some records say it belonged to people called Baileys, and they were farmers. And then, as I talked about the bottle they found under the altar in the church, it belonged to a James St. Lawrence, and St. Lawrence's were some way related to Taylors. They owned the Star at one time, and then in my time I remember Taylor still in it, and they had a grocery shop in one side of it before they moved the other side of the street. But the Star, all the Taylors were very prominent in the 1960 rising and the War of Independence and everything, and consequently the pub was burnt by the Black and Tans in 1922, and I think they got compensation, and then they built it up into the way it is today. It looks very, and there always was a big clock over the door up in the middle of it, which has gone, and we all used to look at this Taylor stock for the time. But beside Taylor's in old times, there was a big two-storey house which was originally the RIC barracks, and in our time Birminghams lived in it, the Birmingham family lived in it. And then on the other side of the RIC barracks was the post office, run in that time by people called Keane, who was retired RIC sergeant. And originally he kept the post office. I think when he retired as a sergeant, it was the other side of the street, along there near where Coleman's lived. But they had moved across the street between the 1901 census and the 1911 census. They had moved across the street. And I was asked by somebody one time how that happened. And how I knew was when my father was in jail after the 1916 Rising, I have a letter he wrote to my granny, and he was commenting on different people in Swords, and he said Keanes have got very swanky since they moved the post office to the other side of the street. So that's how we knew for sure that it was there. So up further then, it's now, the area is now the Bank of Ireland actually. Where the town mall is now, there was a house there which Paddy Cleary lived in that I mentioned before, who was cured by Louis Pasteur, and there was a lot of other houses there, and there was Howard's the butcher shop, which was one of these open butcher shops where you could see them banging the meat on a big wooden thing, you know, and a awning out over it. And beside that then there was a little road that went up to the Malahide Road, which we always called the Gut, or the Gutway. And there were two big red brick houses there and another smaller one. And in the first red brick house lived people called Mourns. Now, the old Mourne man had been a sergeant. He was actually the sergeant when the Fráca took place with the lockout. But his son, Christopher Mourne, or Kit Mourne, he, funnily enough, as I say, you don't know what the background of several people are who were in the Rising, but he was very prominent in the Battle of Ashbourne. Well, now we're going to leave it at there for today. We have been wandering around North Street, but that probably will be part 2 of our film. And we hope you enjoyed it. At this stage, I would like to thank some of the people who've come on board to help us out. Swords Camera Club, who supplied some of the nice up-to-date photographs of the swords of today, and Geraldine, who helps in our office, and Mary, who goes out and researches graveyards, and many people that come along and help at the heritage of the area, which is it's changing all the time, and we have to keep recording it. It's not all about the past, it's what's happening today as well. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.